The restaurant was the kind of place that most people only saw in magazines. Soft golden lights reflected off polished tables, and crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread and rich coffee, mixed with the perfume of expensive flowers placed on every table. It was quiet, in that particular way that happens in very expensive places, where people spoke in careful whispers, afraid to disturb the perfect order of things. The guests were all important, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses. They talked in low voices about business deals, yachts, and vacations in places that most people could only dream about. In the middle of all this, moving quickly but quietly, was a young waitress. She carried a tray with drinks in one hand and menus in the other, her movements precise but almost invisible. She was small, with worn shoes and a simple uniform that made her blend into the background. Most of the guests didn't notice her at all. Some glanced at her briefly before returning to their conversations, some barely spared her a nod. It was her world, this space of silence and wealth, but it was not her place. She had been a waitress here for a few months, and she had learned the rhythm of the restaurant, the soft clinking of silverware, the quiet murmur of the piano in the corner, the sharp click of heels on marble floors. The piano was a grand, shining black instrument placed in the corner of the dining room. Tonight it sat silent, and the young waitress couldn't help but glance at it as she passed. She had grown up around music, though not in a wealthy home or fancy academy. Her father had played the piano when she was very small, but they had never had much money. The piano in their small house had been old and slightly out of tune, but to her it had been a kingdom. She had spent hours tapping the keys, learning melodies by ear, dreaming that one day she might play for people who really listened. Life had other plans, though, and she had spent most of her days helping her family, cleaning homes and working in small cafes. Music was always there in her heart, but never in front of a real audience. Not like this. Tonight, there was tension in the air. The pianist who was supposed to perform had not arrived, and the restaurant owner was pacing nervously in the corner. The guests murmured among themselves, some checking their watches, some frowning at their phones. The young waitress had been serving tables for hours, but she felt her attention being pulled to the piano more than anything else. It was a strange feeling, like a small spark of hope mixed with fear. She had never played in front of anyone like this before. Certainly not here. The idea of touching the piano in this room, where every note could be judged, made her stomach twist with nerves. She moved from table to table, serving champagne and checking on dishes, trying to focus on her work. A man in a sharp suit leaned back in his chair and waved her over. "Excuse me," he said politely, though his voice carried that edge of impatience that comes from people used to getting what they want. She approached, keeping her head low. "Yes, sir?" she asked. "The pianist isn't here yet, is he?" He asked. "No, sir," she replied softly. "I'm afraid not." He nodded, a slight frown on his face, and returned to his conversation. She moved on, feeling the tension grow heavier in the room. The other servers whispered quietly among themselves. Some were worried that the guests would leave. Some joked nervously that maybe someone should play. She laughed along quietly in her head because she knew that someone would never be her. Not in a million years, but then it happened. One of the guests, a tall man with glasses and a polite smile, looked over at her as she passed by the piano. "Hey," he said lightly, almost joking. "Why don't you play something? Just a little tune. Surely you know a song or two." The words made her freeze. She looked down at her shoes, trying to imagine a polite way to say no. She had never played for anyone like this. Her hands shook slightly as she rested them on the tray she was carrying. But the man's gaze was kind, curious, not mocking. She felt a strange pull, a tiny voice inside her saying, maybe just once, maybe just for a moment. She walked slowly toward the piano, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the polished floor itself was trying to hold her back. When she reached the bench, she hesitated, looking at the keys. They were perfect, shining under the warm lights, waiting for someone to bring them to life. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips. It was familiar and strange at the same time. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the clinking of glasses and the faint hum of conversation paused. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself remember the hours she had spent alone at home, learning songs by ear, imagining herself performing. The memory gave her courage, and she pressed down on a single key. The note rang out, clear and bright, cutting through the tense silence of the restaurant. It was only one note, but it felt like the beginning of something important. She pressed another, then another, slowly, carefully, letting the music build like a tiny flame growing into light. Something strange began to happen. The murmurs in the room faded. Guests who had been talking quietly stopped, turning their heads toward the piano. The man who had encouraged her smiled, leaning forward in his chair. The music was simple at first, but it carried a depth that no one expected. It was full of emotion, joy, sadness, hope, and longing all at once. She didn't play for applause or recognition. She played because it was inside her, a story she had kept locked away for too long. For the first time that night, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as someone who carried trays and wiped tables, but as a human being capable of creating something beautiful. She wasn't sure how long she had been playing before she noticed the entire room had gone quiet. The wealthy guests, the important men and women who usually spoke over everything, were listening. Really listening. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had their hands clasped together, almost holding their breath. She felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she had only just begun. Her fingers moved more confidently now, recalling songs she had practiced in secret, songs that had once been her private world. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't need to. The music spoke for her, carrying every feeling she had kept hidden. It was strange to see these people, so powerful in their own worlds, stop everything and just listen. It was like they were hearing not just the notes, but the story of her life. She continued to play. A small smile formed on her lips. She had never imagined this moment, but it felt like it had been waiting for her all along. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew that something inside her had shifted. The room, the people, even the piano itself, seemed to recognize that tonight was different. Tonight, something ordinary, a waitress in a grand restaurant, was about to become extraordinary. And that was only the beginning. The first few notes had barely faded when she realized something remarkable was happening. The room had gone completely quiet, a kind of silence that felt alive, almost waiting for the next sound. She had only meant to play a small tune, something gentle to fill the space until the pianist arrived. But now she could feel the attention of every person in the restaurant. It was strange and overwhelming, and for a moment, her hands hovered above the keys, unsure if she should continue. A tiny voice inside whispered, "You can do this. Just keep going." She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled slowly, and let her fingers move. The first melody was soft, simple, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to catch the ears of the audience. The wealthy guests, who only moments ago had been glancing at their phones or checking the time, now leaned slightly forward. Their drinks remained untouched, their conversations had vanished, and their eyes were fixed on the small figure at the piano. Her fingers danced carefully over the keys. She remembered the hours she had spent alone at home, her small fingers pressing the old piano at her family's house. Each note she played tonight carried the weight of those years of struggle, of quiet longing, and of hope. She didn't just play music. She told a story that no one could see but everyone could feel. The tall man who had encouraged her to play smiled gently, almost in disbelief. He whispered something to the woman sitting next to him, but even her attention didn't leave the piano. She could feel the energy in the room shifting. The laughter and chatter that usually filled the restaurant had been replaced by something deeper, an invisible connection between the music and the listeners. She didn't plan the next notes. They came naturally, flowing from memory and feeling. Each chord seemed to have a life of its own, rising and falling like waves. It was as if the piano had been waiting for her all along, ready to bring her emotions to life. She could feel herself getting lost in the music, her body moving subtly to the rhythm, her mind free from the stress of the day or the weight of her job. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician. She was herself across the room. A few guests exchanged glances. Some tried to hide their astonishment, but it was impossible. One man leaned back, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Another woman wiped a tear from her cheek, quickly hiding it behind her hand. The music seemed to reach into their hearts without permission. Touching parts of them that they rarely allowed themselves to feel, she paused for a brief moment to catch her breath, and the silence felt almost sacred. The piano sat under her fingers, waiting. She could sense the expectation, the unspoken plea from the audience. Play more. Don't stop now. She smiled to herself softly. It was strange to think that these people, who usually judged everything by appearances, were listening so openly. It was almost as if the music had stripped away the barriers they built around themselves, leaving only raw, human emotion. Then she continued, and the room seemed to lean in with her. Her fingers moved faster, but never careless. Each note carried intention, each pause filled with meaning. The music changed from something gentle to something powerful, bold, and full of life. It was like a conversation between her and the audience, a silent exchange that needed no words. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others sat frozen, unsure whether to breathe or speak. Every heart in the room seemed to beat in time with the melody. For her, it was not about impressing anyone. She was not performing for fame, recognition, or money. She was playing because this was the language of her soul. Every sorrow she had carried, every moment of longing and hope poured through her fingers. It was a private story shared with strangers, and somehow it connected them all in the same moment. A waiter nearby, who had been busy serving drinks, stopped mid-step, holding a tray with champagne. He leaned against a wall, watching quietly. He had seen many performers in his time, but none had the raw honesty that she carried. He whispered to himself, almost in awe, "She's something else." The room remained suspended in that strange bubble of stillness. Even the restaurant staff paused in their work, captivated by the unexpected performance. The young waitress could feel the tension and anticipation of the room pressing gently on her shoulders, but instead of fear, it gave her strength. Her fingers moved more confidently now, recalling old pieces she had memorized long ago, melodies that had comforted her during lonely nights. A sudden smile broke across her face as she remembered the very first time she had touched a piano. She had been a little girl then, sitting on a creaky bench in a cramped living room, pressing keys she didn't fully understand. Music had been her escape, her companion, her secret joy. Now, years later, she sat in a grand restaurant, playing in front of people who were completely unfamiliar with her story, and yet they were listening. Really listening. The music shifted again, slower this time, more reflective. Her hands lingered on the keys, drawing out each note with care. It was not a show. It was a confession. She could almost feel the emotions of the guests mingling with her own, the stress of business deals, the loneliness behind polite smiles, the silent worries of those who had everything yet seemed to carry a weight unseen. For a brief moment, the piano became a bridge, connecting all of them through sound, feeling, and understanding. Some of the wealthiest guests, who had spent their lives believing they could buy respect or attention, leaned forward in awe. They had never encountered a performance that demanded such silence, such complete presence. They had never been reminded, so suddenly and unexpectedly, that there are things money cannot touch: raw talent, honesty, and the courage to share it. She continued, lost in the music, unaware of how long she had been playing. Every note was a conversation, every pause a heartbeat, and slowly the laughter and chatter of earlier moments felt like a distant memory. She was no longer a waitress. She was a storyteller, a painter of sound, weaving a tapestry of emotions that filled every corner of the restaurant. When she finally paused, the silence was immediate and complete. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The pause was not awkward. It was reverent. The audience seemed to realize all at once that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. something not meant for applause or praise, but for understanding. Then, slowly, a ripple of quiet claps began. One person's hands touched together, then another. The applause grew, careful at first, then stronger, louder, more insistent. People who had been skeptical, who had expected nothing, now found themselves on their feet. The sound was overwhelming but joyful, a release of the tension that had built in the room. The young waitress smiled, not because she had won their admiration, but because she had shared a piece of herself and it had been heard, the tall man who had first suggested. Shipley approached her, eyes wide with amazement. That was incredible, he said softly. Where did you learn to play like that? She shook her head slightly, smiling. I just practiced, she said simply. There was humility in her voice, a quiet honesty that made him nod in respect. The restaurant owner, who had been anxious about the missing pianist, watched from a distance, a mixture of relief and astonishment on his face. He had expected disappointment tonight, but instead something magical had happened. The young waitress, who had been part of the background, invisible for most of the evening, had turned the room upside down with nothing but a piano and her courage, and in that moment she knew something had changed. Not just for the guests or the staff or even the restaurant itself. Something had changed inside her too. The fear that had held her back for years was dissolving, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had stepped into a world that had seemed impossible. And in doing so, she had discovered that her music could move people, could touch hearts, could change the energy of a room. She closed her eyes, letting the applause wash over her, feeling a warmth that went deeper than any compliment or praise could reach. It was the feeling of being seen, of being heard, of being recognized, even for just a moment, as someone more than a waitress, and as the clapping continued, she felt a tiny spark of hope ignite within her. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment her life was about to change. The applause had barely faded when something unexpected happened. The young waitress realized that she wasn't done yet, not really. The music was still inside her, waiting to be expressed, and the audience seemed to sense it. There was a quiet, almost electric tension in the room, like the air itself was holding its breath. Everyone was watching her, but not in the way they usually watched performers in fancy restaurants. This was different. This was personal. It was as if, through the music, she was speaking directly to each person's heart. And they were listening with every ounce of their attention. She took a deep breath, feeling the smooth keys beneath her fingers, and started again. This time, her hands moved more freely, more confidently. The first notes were delicate, like tiny sparks lighting the edges of a dark room. Slowly, the melody grew, rising and falling like a gentle wave, carrying emotion that no words could express. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was powerful in its honesty. Every person in the restaurant leaned in, as if drawn toward something they could feel but not see. A few of the guests whispered to each other, unable to hide their amazement. One man, a well-dressed businessman, shook his head slightly, as if trying to convince himself he wasn't imagining what he was hearing. Who is this?" he asked swiftly, almost to himself. His companion didn't answer right away, her eyes fixed on the young waitress, mouth slightly open in surprise. "I don't know," she said finally, "but it's incredible." The music flowed effortlessly, weaving through different moods and feelings. At times it was soft and tender, almost like a lullaby, comforting and gentle. At other times it became bold and confident, strong and commanding, filling the room with energy that seemed to vibrate through the polished floors and chandeliers. Each note was deliberate, each pause intentional. She was telling a story without words, letting the piano speak for her, and somehow the audience understood every word. She remembered the long nights she had spent alone, practicing in the dim light of her small home. She remembered the times when her hands had ached from hours of pressing keys, when her family had little money for piano lessons, and yet she had never stopped dreaming. Every note she played now carried those memories, those struggles, those quiet victories. It was as if her past had followed her to this grand restaurant and had transformed into something beautiful, something that could touch people in ways she had never imagined. Across the room, the restaurant staff watched in awe. The other waiters and waitresses had seen performers before, of course, but never like this. This wasn't just talent, it was authenticity, honesty, and courage all rolled into one. One of the servers whispered to another, "She's amazing. Look at how everyone is listening." The other nodded silently, unable to take her eyes off the young waitress at the piano. Even the restaurant owner, who had been nervously checking the clock earlier, was standing quietly by the bar, a mixture of astonishment and admiration on his face. The wealthy guests, used to commanding attention and being the center of influence, were now powerless in the face of her music. Their phones lay forgotten on the tables, their drinks untouched. They were captivated not by fame or money, but by something far more rare, genuine talent and emotion. Some of them closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others leaned forward, unable to tear their gaze away. It was a strange, almost magical moment where status, wealth, and pride no longer mattered. All that existed was the music and the person creating it. As she played, the young waitress felt a wave of emotion rise within her. She had always dreamed of this, but never dared to imagine it could feel like this. The music was no longer just sound, it was connection. She could feel the audience responding, their hearts moving with her own. It was a conversation without words, a silent communication that transcended everything else in the room. Her hands moved faster now, dancing across the keys with a freedom she had never experienced before. She allowed herself to take risks, to explore melodies that had been tucked away in her memory for years. She hit notes that soared and dipped, notes that were sharp and soft, notes that carried laughter, sorrow, hope, and love all at once. The piano became an extension of herself, and through it, she shared the very essence of who she was. Some of the guests gasped softly, surprised at the depth of feeling the young waitress was able to convey. Others sat silently, tears brimming in their eyes, trying to process the unexpected beauty of what they were witnessing. A woman in a simple black dress touched her hand to her chest, as if to steady the rapid beating of her heart. She had seen many performances in her life, but none had moved her like this. It wasn't about perfection or technique, it was about honesty, and the courage to express it. The room seemed to shrink around her, drawing everyone closer into this shared moment. The sound of the piano filled every corner, yet it was intimate, personal, and raw. Every person present felt it in their own way, some with nostalgia, others with longing, and some with a sense of hope they hadn't realized they were missing. The young waitress didn't just play for them. She played with them, inviting them to be part of something larger than themselves. She noticed a few guests exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. They were the kind of people used to having control over everything in their lives. Yet here they were, powerless to do anything but listen. It was humbling in the most beautiful sense. She realized with a quiet thrill that this moment was bigger than any audience she had ever imagined. It was not about approval or praise, it was about connection, and she had found it in the most unexpected place. Her music shifted once again, this time becoming soft and reflective. She allowed the melody to linger, letting each note resonate in the room. She could sense the emotions of the guests mingling with her own, creating a shared experience that was both personal and universal. For a brief moment, it felt as if the restaurant itself had disappeared, leaving only the piano, the music, and the hearts of those who were listening. Even the staff, who had been busy serving throughout the evening, had stopped moving. They leaned against counters or walls, listening with rapt attention. Some whispered to each other, barely able to contain their amazement. One of the servers muttered, "I've never seen anything like this," and the other nodded, eyes wide. The young waitress didn't notice them. She didn't need to. She was completely immersed, letting the music guide her, letting it flow from her heart to the keys. Minutes passed, though she didn't keep track. Time seemed to lose meaning in the presence of music so honest, so heartfelt. Every chord, every pause, every note was intentional yet effortless. She had never played like this before, not in front of anyone, and yet it felt natural. It felt as if the piano had been waiting for this moment, and she was exactly the person it had been waiting for when she finally slowed the tempo. Letting the music become softer, gentler, the room held its breath again. There was no talking, no shifting in chairs, only the quiet reverence of people fully present. And then, as she struck the final note, it lingered in the air, vibrating softly. And the audience could not contain themselves any longer. Applause erupted, growing louder and louder until it filled every corner of the restaurant. Some guests jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering with genuine amazement. Others remained seated, tears streaming down their faces, still trying to absorb what they had just experienced. The young waitress sat at the piano, hands trembling slightly, but smiling quietly. She had done something she had never imagined possible, and the feeling was overwhelming in the most beautiful way. The tall man who had first encouraged her to play approached, eyes wide with admiration. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "That was extraordinary." She shook her head, smiling softly. "I just played what I felt," she said. Her voice was calm, humble, but there was a spark of pride in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The restaurant owner, standing in the back, finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and awe on his face. He had feared disappointment tonight, but instead he had witnessed something magical. The young waitress, once invisible among the wealth and status of the restaurant, had captured everyone's attention with nothing but a piano and her courage, and in that moment, she realized something important. This was not just a performance. It was proof of what could happen when talent, courage, and opportunity meet. It was proof that even in the most unexpected places, magic could exist. She had taken a step she never thought she could, and in doing so, had changed the energy of the room, had touched hearts, and had shown that she was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The applause continued, filling her with warmth and a quiet sense of possibility. And as she looked around the room, at the faces of people who had once ignored her, she knew that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted tonight, not just in her life, but in the lives of everyone who had listened. She took a deep breath and let the sound of the applause wash over her. The music had connected them all, even for just a short while, and she felt a spark of hope that this moment could lead to something bigger. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a bridge, a voice, and a reminder of the power of courage and authenticity, and she knew, deep in her heart, that this was, the room was buzzing, but in a way that was completely different from before. This was not the usual chatter of wealthy guests comparing business deals or fashion choices. This was a quiet energy of awe, respect, and curiosity. The young waitress had just finished a performance that no one could stop talking about, though most were too stunned to speak right away. Her music had done something rare. It had broken through the walls of pretense and pride that filled the room, leaving only the raw, human connection between her and everyone listening. As she sat at the piano, catching her breath, she noticed the way the guests were looking at her now. There were no sneers, no impatient glances. Their eyes were wide, full of admiration, some even tinged with disbelief. It was a look she had never seen directed at her before. Usually she was invisible in this world of marble floors and golden chandeliers, a mere shadow moving among people who had everything and noticed nothing. But now she was seen, truly seen. The tall man who had first encouraged her to play walked up to the piano slowly, almost cautiously, as if he didn't want to break the spell. He was clearly impressed, and there was a spark of genuine excitement in his eyes. "That was, extraordinary," he said softly. "I've heard many pianists in my life, but I've never felt something like that. Where did you learn to play like this?" The young waitress shook her head slightly, smiling. "I practiced," she said simply. It was the truth. She hadn't attended fancy schools or studied under famous teachers. She had learned at home, in quiet hours when no one was watching, pressing the keys on an old piano, memorizing melodies, and letting the music become part of her soul. She had always loved the piano, and now, finally, it felt like the piano loved her back. The guests began to approach slowly. At first, it was polite curiosity questions about how long she had been playing, where she had learned, but as they spoke, their tone softened into genuine admiration. Some wanted to shake her hand, others simply stood, staring at the piano as if it held the secret to something they had forgotten in their own lives. One woman, holding a glass of champagne, whispered to her companion, "I've never experienced anything like this in my entire life. And she's just a waitress." Her words were not cruel. They were amazed, even humbled. The young waitress felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment. She had never performed for such an audience before, and the attention was almost overwhelming. But she reminded herself that this wasn't about recognition. This was about the music and the connection it had created. It was about the simple human truth that talent and passion could exist anywhere. Even in someone who carried trays of drinks for a living. The restaurant owner, who had been pacing nervously earlier, stepped forward. His usual stern expression was softened by a rare smile. "I wasn't sure what to expect tonight," he admitted quietly, "but you've changed everything in this room." I think we all needed to be reminded of something we've forgotten, that beauty and talent can come from the most unexpected places. The young waitress nodded, still slightly breathless. She hadn't expected this kind of response. She had only wanted to play, to let her music speak for her. And now, seeing the respect and admiration in their faces, she realized that the music had spoken louder than words ever could. Guests, who had been quietly sitting at their tables, began to stand and approach. Some to compliment her, others simply to watch her hands glide over the keys. The applause had started again, slower this time, more personal, less about spectacle, and more about genuine appreciation. One of the older men, someone who clearly had lived a life of wealth and privilege, placed a hand on her shoulder gently and said, "You have a gift. Don't ever forget it." Her heart warmed at those words. For so long, she had wondered if her talent would ever matter. She had always felt small, invisible, like her life would be defined by waiting tables and carrying trays. And now, for the first time, someone had told her that what she carried within herself was valuable, meaningful, and powerful. Other guests began to ask more questions. Not just about her music, but about her life. Where had she grown up? How had she learned to play? What dreams did she have? She answered each question with quiet honesty, smiling shyly when people expressed disbelief that someone with so little had so much talent. The room had changed. The wealthy guests, who were used to giving orders and being in control, had been disarmed by her music. They were listening, learning, and even admiring the courage it had taken to play in front of them. The young waitress felt a sense of calm wash over her. For so long she had carried the fear of being judged, of being seen as unworthy or inadequate. But in this moment, surrounded by people who were not only impressed but genuinely touched, she felt something shift inside her. The fear had not disappeared completely, but it had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence that this was her path, and her music deserved to be heard. The restaurant owner stepped forward again, now speaking to the entire room. "Tonight we witnessed something special," he said. "This young woman has reminded us that talent doesn't always come in a polished package. Sometimes it comes quietly from the most unexpected places. And yet, when it is revealed, it can change everything." I think we all feel a little richer for having experienced it. The guests nodded in agreement, murmuring softly among themselves. There was a newfound respect in the room, a recognition that they had been part of a rare and genuine moment. The young waitress sat at the piano, feeling a sense of pride that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with being acknowledged for who she truly was. One of the younger guests, a woman who had been quietly watching from the back, finally stepped forward. "Would you consider playing again sometime?" she asked. "We would love to hear more of your music. You have a way of reaching people that is extraordinary." The young waitress smiled softly, a mixture of humility and excitement. "I would love to," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. She had never imagined being asked to play again in a place like this, and yet the possibility felt real. Almost like a dream that was finally within reach, the audience continued to linger, reluctant to leave, as if afraid that the magic of the moment would disappear if they did. Some lingered near the piano, still clapping softly, while others whispered among themselves, sharing the wonder they had just witnessed. It was as if the room had been transformed, not by wealth or grandeur, but by something far more powerful: honesty, courage, and talent that refused to be hidden. The young waitress took a deep breath, letting the applause and whispers wash over her. She had never felt anything like this before. The validation was not the kind she had expected or even wanted. It was deeper, more meaningful. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time, and that feeling, more than anything, made her want to keep playing, to keep sharing her music, to keep stepping into the world with the courage she had found tonight. The restaurant owner approached her once more, smiling warmly. "If you're willing, we would love to have you perform here regularly," he said. "Not as a novelty, but as a musician. You've reminded us what it means to really listen, and I think our guests and our staff would benefit from experiencing that again and again." Her eyes widened slightly. She had never imagined anything like this. Her job as a waitress had always been just that, a way to make ends meet. But now, someone was offering her a chance to step into her talent, to be recognized not for what she carried on trays, but for the music that lived inside her. It was overwhelming, humbling, and exhilarating all at once. She nodded slowly, a small smile spreading across her face. "I would love to," she said softly. The words felt like a promise, not just to the guests or the restaurant, but to herself. She had taken a step tonight that changed everything, and now she was ready to take the next one. As the guests began to leave, still talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed, she sat back at the piano and let her fingers rest on the keys. The room was returning to its normal rhythm, but the energy had shifted permanently. The wealthy crowd had come expecting dinner and entertainment, but they had left with something far more valuable: a reminder of the power of courage, talent, and authenticity. And the young waitress, for the first time in her life, felt truly seen, not just as a server or someone in the background, but as a musician, a storyteller, and a human being with something meaningful to offer the world. For her, the night was not just a performance. It was a turning point. She had discovered that the world could notice her, appreciate her, and even be moved by her. And with that realization came a quiet determination. This was only the beginning. The night slowly drew to a close, but the energy of what had happened still lingered in the restaurant. The wealthy guests had left, but their awe and respect had left a permanent mark on the young waitress. She sat at the piano one last time, letting her fingers glide over the keys, softly and thoughtfully. The music she played now was gentle, reflective, almost like a conversation with herself, with her past, and with the possibilities of the future. Earlier that evening, she had walked into this restaurant as just a waitress, carrying trays, taking orders, and trying to stay invisible. She had blended into the background, unnoticed, a small figure moving quietly among people who lived in a world of privilege and power. But now she had discovered something extraordinary. Her music could reach beyond those walls, beyond wealth, beyond appearances. Her music could touch hearts, change moods, and remind people of something they had almost forgotten. The applause from earlier still echoed in her mind. It wasn't just the sound of hands clapping, it was the acknowledgement that she mattered, that her talent mattered, that she had a voice that could be heard. She closed her eyes and remembered the first time she had touched a piano in a small room at home. Back then, she had played alone, without anyone to listen, without anyone to encourage her. And now, years later, here she was in a grand restaurant, having shared her music with people who had seemed untouchable, unreachable, and who now had seen her as more than she had ever imagined. The restaurant owner approached her quietly, a smile softening the usually stern lines of his face. "If you are willing," he said, "I would like to offer you the chance to perform here regularly. Not just as a novelty or a one-time surprise, but as a true musician. People should hear you, and we would all be lucky to experience it again. She looked up at him, her heart racing. The offer was more than she had dreamed of. For so long, her life had been about survival, about working hard and quietly, never imagining that her dreams could be recognized, let alone rewarded. And now, someone was giving her a chance to step fully into the life she had always wanted. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of excitement, gratitude, and a little disbelief. I would love to, she said softly. Almost in awe of her own words, the restaurant staff had gathered around as well, quietly watching the exchange. They had witnessed the transformation, the power of her music to silence and then captivate the audience. Some of them approached her, offering congratulations, words of admiration, and even encouragement. One of the older servers, someone who had worked there for years, said quietly, "You've reminded all of us why we do this job." Tonight wasn't just about serving or performing, it was about humanity, about heart. You have a gift and you've shared it with all of us? Her fingers lingered on the keys for a moment, and then she began to play again, softly, letting the music flow naturally. This time she wasn't performing for anyone in particular. She was playing for herself, for the moment, for the feeling that had been building inside her for so long. Every note was a reminder that she could step into her own power, that her life could be more than the small, hidden existence she had known. As she played, she thought about the faces of the guests who had been in the room earlier. The disbelief, the admiration, the emotion, it was all real. They had come expecting only an elegant dining experience, a quiet evening with background music, and instead they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen courage, raw talent, and authenticity. And in seeing her, they had been reminded of their own humanity. That thought made her smile quietly. She had not only changed her own life that night, but she had also left a mark on the people who had witnessed her music. After a while, she finally stopped playing, letting the last notes hang in the air before fading into silence. She sat there for a moment, taking in the quiet, the soft glow of the lights, and the knowledge that something significant had just happened. This was not the end, it was the beginning. She had stepped into a world that she had never thought was meant for her, and in doing so, she had discovered that she belonged there more than she had imagined. The restaurant owner approached once more, extending a hand. "We'll make sure this opportunity works for you. You have something rare, something special, and now it's time for the world to see it." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy and hope. She took his hand, shaking it firmly, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down." As the staff began to clean up, the young waitress walked slowly toward the exit, still feeling the energy of the evening humming through her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was stepping out of the shadows. She had carried so much in silence for so long, dreams, fears, doubts, and desires, and now, for the first time, she felt seen, heard, and understood. The world, which had seemed so large and inaccessible, suddenly felt like a place where she could belong. The next day, as she returned to the restaurant, she noticed a subtle shift. Guests who had been there the night before approached her with smiles, some greeting her warmly, some complimenting her music. She could see a glimmer of respect in the eyes of people who had once ignored her, and it filled her with a quiet confidence. The restaurant staff treated her differently too, not with surprise or disbelief, but with a genuine recognition of her talent and her courage. She had become part of the fabric of the place, not just as a waitress, but as a musician whose presence carried meaning. Over the next few weeks, she began performing regularly at the restaurant. Each time she played, she noticed the subtle changes in the guests, their attentiveness, their appreciation, their willingness to connect through music. She began to feel more confident, exploring more challenging pieces, experimenting with emotion and expression. The piano, once a distant dream, had become a partner in her life, a tool through which she could share herself with the world. Her life began to change in small but significant ways. Opportunities she had never imagined started to appear. Musicians who had attended her performances offered guidance and mentorship. People in the music community began to take notice of her talent, inviting her to play in other venues, to collaborate, and to continue growing as an artist. Each step was a reminder that her courage and dedication had opened doors she had never thought possible, but perhaps the most important change was within herself. She had always doubted her own abilities, always questioned whether her dreams were realistic or worthwhile. And now, having played in front of an audience that truly listened and appreciated her, she felt a new sense of self-worth. She realized that talent and passion could not be measured by status or wealth. They could not be confined by circumstance. They were part of her, and she had the right to share them with the world. The young Waitress stern musician often thought back to that night, remembering the hush that had fallen over the room when she first touched the keys. She remembered the surprise and admiration in the eyes of the wealthy guests, and she remembered the way her own heart had felt nervous, excited, and alive all at once. That moment had changed her life. It had shown her that courage and authenticity could create opportunities, inspire others, and open doors that had once seemed permanently closed as she played each day. She no longer saw herself merely as a waitress. She was an artist, a storyteller, and a human being capable of creating beauty. She had learned that her life could hold more than survival. It could hold passion, expression, and the fulfillment of dreams. And she carried that lesson with her, not only in her music, but in the way she approached every moment of her life. The restaurant became more than a workplace. It became a stage, a place where her story could unfold, and a space where people could be reminded of the power of courage, talent, and authenticity. Guests returned, hoping to hear her play again, and each performance reminded her that even in the most unexpected places, greatness could be found. She was living proof of that truth, and every note she played carried the message: talent knows no boundaries. Courage has the power to transform. And dreams are worth pursuing, and so her life continued, transformed by one night, one performance, and one choice to step forward despite fear. The young waitress who had once felt invisible now stood confidently at the piano, sharing her music, her heart, and her story with everyone who would listen. She had discovered that the world could notice her, value her, and even be inspired by her. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life, but she had reminded everyone who heard her music that extraordinary moments can come from the most ordinary places. If only one has the courage to reach for them. She had started as a waitress, carrying trays, moving quietly through the background. But she had become so much more: a musician, a storyteller, and a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever doubted their own worth. And as her fingers rested on the keys each evening, ready to play, she knew that she had found her place in the world, not because it was given to her, but because she had the courage to take it. Her journey was only beginning, and every note she played would continue to remind her and everyone who listened that talent, passion, and heart can never be hidden forever.